public access perspective? Good. Well, the hour of 6:30 having come and gone, we'll call the meeting of the Wausau Policing Task Force to order. The first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes, which were in your packet.
So moved.
Been moved by Mike, second by Pat. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. And we are privileged to have with us two distinguished co-authors or survey evaluators extraordinary and summarizers of focus groups join us with April and Eric. And we apologize for the late notice, but we were trying to make sure that what we put together was in a near final, if not final form. And that was shared with you yesterday relative to a summary of the survey and focus groups. And I'll turn it over to Eric or April, whichever one of you wants to take the lead.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I think we're going to have April start us off, right?
Sure. I think I can share my screen, if that's all right.
That would be wonderful.
Okay. All right. So I think my task is just to give maybe a brief overview of phase 2. I know that most of what is new to you is phase 3. This report, the phase 2 report, has undergone a revision from last time. So, and I guess I'm not sure if the task force has seen a previous draft of this, a previous kind of near final draft of this. But it's more consolidated, and one thing I tried to do in this report is, and this is thinking with Eric's feedback and a few others, really tried to give attention to the many positive findings in the survey data. And so there's more of a prioritization of that. Of course, and I think the executive summary is meant to really highlight this. So the meat of this report is really in the executive summary. And it tries to bring out the positive as well as really characterize what are those specific demographic groups where we saw some more negative or less positive attitudes toward Wausau policing and police officer behaviors. So trying to give that direction toward where phase 3 went. I'm not sure how much time you all have had to look at this draft or this version of the phase 2 report. And I knowing that you've already seen a version of it, I thought maybe what I would do is give that introduction and then ask if you have any specific questions or areas that you would like me to address.
That's a great approach if you want to proceed with that.
April, are you going to?
Sorry?
Were you going to? I thought I heard you say you were going to give a little overview, or did I miss that?
Well,
Sorry.
this was the overview. Sorry,
Okay.
Okay.
I think I don't know if you want me to repeat any of the primary findings, or if people had a chance to review that executive summary, which reviews it. I'm not sure where you're all at. I didn't want to rehash anything if you don't need it.
Michael,
Yeah, I just want to say again, great job. As I go through the report, I think it's really well constructed. I did read the report in its entirety. It summarizes some of the key findings we've had or discussed up to this point. And, at this point, I've gone through anything that we're doing or on our agenda with the lens of thinking, okay, how do I take this and make it a recommendation? I think we'll talk about some of that maybe at the end, John.
Yes.
But I don't have a whole lot of questions that I don't think are going to come up in a discussion of this third section, because the way we left this last time we looked at some of this data was, this is really great, but we have some key information that we would love some additional feedback from some of these groups that we identified as, not having the same perception as the rest of the community. And if it's all right, I'd like to jump right there, because I think we've covered this, and I think that it's really well done, and the report I don't have any questions with.
I would agree with that.
Is there a consensus? I'm looking.
I would agree with that assessment as well.
So I think we were quite honestly waiting for the Phase 3 report before we started moving into the area of recommendations and developing recommendations. So again, I want to reiterate Michael's comments and thank you for all the work on the entire process, community engagement process, but these reports tonight as well. So I think what we will do later, just to try to set the table, if you will, is we'll look at the findings where there's an actionable item or an item that may merit additional follow-up from us relative to recommendations, and not all the findings are of that nature. And then focus in on those to see if, based upon the findings of the report, whether or not we as a task force want to make any recommendations. So with that, if you wanted to move on to the third report, or the focus group report?
Sure, yeah, and this is Eric. I'll go ahead and take the lead in that. But at any point, if you have questions, comments that you feel really need to be addressed, please feel free to interrupt at any time. So just as a reminder, I think Michael hit it on the head when he said, we knew that after the survey, there were a subset of groups, residents, that had a slightly more negative viewpoint towards policing than the average, resident. So we identified some of those groups. I think April put that on the screen. And so part of Phase 3, the purpose was to interview or do focus groups with those subsets or subsets of those subsets. And so we were tasked with, for example, bringing people of color to the table, particularly Hmong individuals that were underrepresented in the survey. We talked about having people who had prior experience with being stopped, pulled over, or arrested by the police. We talked about talking with people who had a history of mental health illnesses or challenges, and so on. So we really made an effort to bring some of those groups to the table, and I think the findings are, what they are. And what I'd like to do before jumping in and answering questions about the findings is really just set the table a little bit about some expectations. And I'm doing this partly for your benefit, but also for anyone that may be listening in from the media, from just the average, public resident of Wausau. Just a couple of reminders, and this is written into the report, but we want to make sure everyone understands that the focus groups were designed to capture the viewpoints of a subset of individuals who are identified in the survey phase who had, on average, a less positive view about the police. So almost by nature, this report is a little more focused on sort of a subset of people who had a more negative viewpoint on average for the Wausau Police. But I don't want people to mistake that as somehow reflective, therefore, of the broader population, because as April pointed out, in most cases, 85 to 90% of the people that were surveyed had very positive views toward policing in Wausau. The goal, therefore, was to gain really deeper insight into why some people feel as they do toward the police, sort of gain a window into why some people might have a little more negative viewpoint towards the police. So as we're thinking about this, it's important to keep in mind the following, that we can't assume that the 31 people that we brought together in the resident focus groups, plus eight police officers that also participated in some police officer focus groups. We can't assume that these represent the broader population. For example, it's not really appropriate to extrapolate findings from those individuals to represent the subgroups of which they're a part with any degree of confidence. This isn't a random sample. This is not a scientific sample. So I don't want anyone to overreact to some of the negative findings, and to remember that these were self-selecting individuals that participated, including the police officers, right? They were invited by, in some cases, the police chiefs, or at least by some leaders in the police department. So all of them, all of the participants, whether residents or police officers, were really self-selecting. And many of them therefore engaged because they really felt like they had something to say. You know, in particular, residents who may have had a previous experience with the Wausau police. There were a good number of people who had those direct experiences and really wanted to share those experiences with us. We also would like everyone to recognize that what residents have said, or what they did say in the focus groups and interviews, are really based on their personal experiences and their perceptions. And therefore, they don't necessarily represent objective truth, right, with a capital T. For example, although we clearly asked residents to share experiences involving their experiences involving the Wausau police during the last, say, 12 to 24 months, to be honest, many residents conflated all past experiences and shared experiences that really had nothing to do with the Wausau police. And in some cases, even though we tried to ask them specifically, well, was this with the Wausau police, or was this an experience you had in some other jurisdiction? And they didn't seem able or willing in some cases to differentiate at times between experiences with Wausau police and other police forces. So I just point that out because I don't think that means that the information is not insightful. It's just that we can't assume that everything that we recorded is absolutely true, or absolutely true about the Wausau police. At the
Eric,
same
can I
time-
chime in one?
Yeah.
Can I chime
yeah,
in with one thing?
Yeah.
I just
please.
wanted to reinforce one thing that you mentioned that I think is really, really important for us all to keep in mind, which was that we can't extrapolate from these participants' responses to the general community, but also that we can't extrapolate from their responses to the groups of which they are members. So, when we saw somewhat less positive responses from some demographic groups than others, those were averages, and there was variability within every one of those groups as well. So I really would be concerned that people would draw inferences that everybody who is under 30 and of non-heterosexual orientation is going to have less positive views toward the police. That's not the case. So I think that's really, really important to keep in mind, that of those who were willing to tell their stories and share their experiences, and who presumably did some self-selecting in to share those experiences, that's what they are. And it'd be really dangerous for us to extrapolate, or for the media to extrapolate beyond that.
Yeah, thank you, April. That really clarifies better what I was trying to say, or part of what I was trying to say. So thank you. At the same time, many residents actually did have interactions with the Wausau police, and they were able to share very specific interactions and stories. So I think it would be a mistake also to presume that the experiences of these residents don't matter somehow. So we're trying to strike, I guess, a middle ground here, where we don't want you to extrapolate these findings to the general population, but at the same time, maybe these insights can provide a window into some of the reasons why people who feel a little more negative on average towards the Wausau police feel that way, and maybe give you some insights into that. Let me give you another example of why I think it's important to take these, what we found, somewhat seriously. I personally was surprised to find that nearly every resident participant, whether or not they had had a very specific negative experience with Wausau police, also had very positive things to say about the police. In other words, they weren't just simply showing up with a massive axe to grind. I mean, I'm sure some people did, but they nearly to a person also had very positive things to say. So it showed me that they were somewhat self-reflective, even if they maybe came with some preconceptions about their viewpoints towards the police. So they were aware enough to be able to point out some positives alongside some of the negatives that they shared. A significant number of residents were quick to point out some of those negative interactions where they felt maybe officers had behaved inappropriately. But another interesting sort of takeaway is that nearly every person who had something negative to say said, sort of in the next breath or the next sentence or later in their narrative, that they did not believe that the vast majority of officers for the Wausau Police Department were behaving inappropriately. So even if they had a story in which somebody behaved inappropriately in their opinion, they agreed that the vast majority of officers did not behave inappropriately, but in fact did a good job overall, were professional, and had a really challenging job, and were very sort of sympathetic to the tough job that police have. But they frequently mentioned that there were one or two officers that they felt were engaging in behavior that they didn't appreciate, and that there seemed to be those one or two officers, and of course they didn't identify anyone specifically, but they said that the problem was really in a very minority, small group of officers when they reported a negative experience. So as far as findings, I don't think I'm going to elaborate a lot on the findings myself, because I think that they're pretty self-explanatory, but I would love to answer some questions. I will just mention a couple of, I guess, commonalities, and we tried to write the report up so that we could sort of share and juxtapose what residents were saying and what police were saying, and there was actually quite a lot of agreement and among the police and the residents who participated, and there were some areas that maybe you could argue were gaps or disagreements, and I think those areas are pretty self-evident. But here's one area that was a very, I think both residents and the police had a very common perspective, which is around mental health support for encounters and situations that police face regularly involving people in mental health crises, substance abuse and misuse challenges and crises, and so forth. And I think everybody from police to residents recognized the difficulty of these situations, that the police were really not, did not necessarily have complete training to do that. That was not really the primary role and responsibility of the police. And yet, there wasn't anyone else who could really do or be there in crisis situations to respond. And so I think everybody was very cognizant of that and appreciative of what the police are trying to do, but also recognize that there's room for improvement. And therefore, for those who knew about the CART program, both residents and police, there was a strong desire to expand the CART program, support for the CART program, and involving more community resources to support the police who may have to deal with these kind of situations. However, the police were very clear, the residents did not express this, but the police were very clear that they did not want to see an expansion of CART at the expense of reducing patrols. So if there was some kind of a limited pie of resources, they're not sure that trade-off was worth it. If there are more resources, though, they were very supportive of the CART program and expanding the CART program. I think another interesting takeaway that I'll just highlight is the issue of mental health resources for officers, non-supervisors, and let's be very real about this. There were only 3 police non-supervisors who participated, so I don't feel confident saying this is reflective of the entire non-supervisor police force, but those that we spoke with to a person were not particularly thrilled with the mental health resources that are available for officers. And all 3 had pointed out situations where they had tried to access mental health resources and found there to be barriers and challenges. and just recognizing overall that is a concern to those non-supervisor officers. The supervisors, on the other hand, did not seem to see the mental health challenges as an acute problem. Some pointed out, well, if you compared where we are today to where we were 10 years ago, we have made tremendous strides in the police department to make mental health resources available, and I think the non-supervisor officers recognize that as well. But the supervisors didn't seem to see the problem as quite as acutely, or any deficit in resources as acutely as the non-supervisors. So just an interesting finding that I wanted to point out. And then I'll just point out one other finding. I feel like there's a lot of sort of discussion in the findings about, these residents kind of felt, maybe negatively about this, and this, and there's different categories of things that we did. And the police may have had a very different perspective. And one of them, because I know this is something that, the police were very concerned about from the get-go, and many residents were concerned about, has to do with police bias, whether, not just issues of race and ethnicity, but bias in terms of, gender, sexual identity, age, mental health status, any type of bias really. And the residents did feel as though there is some bias within the police, but I want to point out that, it wasn't just, I think, picking on the police. I think, for example, they noted that, a few people noted that all of us are biased, right? So they admitted that they themselves come to, into interactions and encounters with the police with some preconceived biases of their own. They also believe the police, in some cases, have biases that they bring to the table. And, they were even able to point out that, if we're really going to address biases and discrimination generally, it's not just about the police. In fact, it may be even more about the community at large. It may be more about, issues that our community is facing, not just somehow specific to the police. So if we want to talk about having, less bias, it's not just a police problem, or it is a community problem that needs to be addressed more broadly. So I wanted just to point that out. I think officers felt like, they're receiving some unfair criticism that stems from, national media reports that are going on about, police behavior in other jurisdictions, some social movements that seem to be sort of anti-police, and really just some negative social media that tends to influence residents' opinions about the police, especially younger residents. And I think actually most of the residents really agreed that that kind of national media, social media, and so forth really actually did influence their opinions. And so I think the police were very concerned about what they perceived to be this uptick in claims that people feel like the police are biased, when they feel that they're coming to the table as professionals that have been trained to leave their biases at the door. And they acknowledge, that they have personal biases, that they come, with belief systems and ideas that may differ from residents, but they understand that they really have to set those aside, on a daily basis, and they really take pride in being able to do that. And they also felt very comfortable in saying, listen, it's not in our interest to engage in that kind of behavior. So if we see officers, engaging that kind of behavior, we are incentivized to call that out, because if we don't, that's going to come back, to harm the police generally. And so they felt that there was a strong sort of internal sense of accountability if there were officers who, for some reason, were, engaged in some inappropriate behavior. So I don't think residents felt quite as confident about that, or maybe they just felt like the accountability processes aren't as transparent to them, meaning they don't see if a police officer is disciplined, they don't know if police officers are disciplined if they, make a mistake, but the police are very aware of a strong culture of accountability within the department. So a lot of the findings, if I could just sum up here briefly, and then I'm happy to answer questions, I think revolve around perceptions, really, about how certain residents who, on average, feel a little more negatively towards police perceive their what the police are doing, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, and then differences in perceptions with how the police feel that they are acting and interacting. And I say it that way because I don't know. I mean, I can't say from this report that it seems like there's, some kind of actual problem. I mean, there's not data that suggests we know for certain that there are these problems, these concerns, these issues, but there are perceptions in some cases. And so for me, it comes down to, does the task force want or need or feel as if there's a need to address some perception gaps between a small percentage of residents who have, on average, more negative feelings towards the police and what police are actually doing. So I think I'll just kind of stop there and ask if anyone has any questions, comments, or like us to share anything else.
Pat?
Evening, Eric. It's Pat Beckham. Could you tell us how the focus groups worked? Did you have the supervisory police in a room together for one session and the non-supervisors in another and the people of color in another? Or how did that happen?
Sure, happy to share that. So when it comes to the police, we worked with the police department. There were a couple people in particular, I won't mention their names, that were helping us to, I guess, pass the word on to police officers about the opportunity to participate. And so and it was the police themselves, I think, with Chief Blivens' sort of advice, suggested we do 2 focus groups, one with supervisors and one with non-supervisors. So they themselves kind of put the word out about those 2 different groups, and then we organized times for those 2 groups, and then I received some emails and communications with the police officers themselves. So they kind of directed the police department directed those individuals to contact me personally if they were interested in participating, and we set up 2 separate virtual events, one with supervisors and one with non-supervisors. So that's how that worked. As far as the other groups, we kind of worked with a number of different individuals and organizations to try to recruit different people who reflected the sort of subgroups that had been identified by the Phase 2 survey report. So, for example, we worked with some folks who were well connected with Black and brown people in our community. So we had a focus group that was really dedicated to people of color, and that group had a number of people identified as Black or African American and Hispanic or Latino, as well as a couple of Native American participants. And similarly, when it came to people who were younger, we reached out to some different connections that we had in the school district and in other places, and were able to get a couple of focus groups with people who were sort of in the 16 to, I can't remember what it was now, I think I want to say 16 to 22 range, and then we had 23 to 30 in another focus group. And then in some of the other focus groups that I'll share in a minute, we also had some young people that just happened to hear about them and managed to participate in a different focus group. But we did have a couple groups dedicated to young people. And then we also had a group that was dedicated to Hmong residents, and we actually had a Hmong facilitator do that group, and so we had about 7 or 8 Hmong residents who participated in that group. And then I guess you could say we also reached out to some of the county diversion programs, some of the organizations that work with people with substance abuse issues. We partnered with a couple of other organizations like the Marathon County Literacy Council that has a lot of folks who have experience with being stopped or pulled over by the police, and also mental health challenges. And we actually did 2 focus groups, I think. We did one focus group in person at the Marathon County Literacy Council, and then I think we did a couple virtual ones also with people who frequented the Marathon County Literacy Council. And from those groups, we had quite a mixture of people who identified as having mental health challenges, young people, people of different race and ethnicity. So I don't want to say it was a hodgepodge, but those focus groups were really kind of a mixture of a lot of the different subcategories of people we were seeking to talk with. And then there were some people who wanted to participate in the focus groups, but for whatever reason the time didn't work out and they still wanted to share their viewpoints. So we did about 4 or 5 interviews, one-on-one interviews, to make sure that we had heard the voices of those other people who weren't able to join the focus groups. So Pat, I don't know if that answers your question. Do you have any follow-up with that you'd like to know?
Just that within those, when you met with those groups, whether it was virtual or in person, they were able to hear what the other people were saying, and there was a discourse.
Correct. With the exception of the 4 or 5 interviews that we did that were just one-on-one, yes. The others usually had multiple people in the space who were sharing their experiences.
Okay, and then I don't know if I picked up on it correctly or not, but in the reactions you got from the police, it seemed like they were reacting as if they had been maybe not harshly, but that the survey itself had ended up with them being on the butt end of criticism. And the survey, when I read it, didn't seem like it was very critical of the police. I'm wondering any reaction to that, or why were they feeling that they had been maybe not unfairly criticized, but inappropriately?
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead. April, were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
Either one.
Okay, I'll jump in then. Yeah, I mean, I'll just give you my impressions, and then, of course, one thing in the report is we tried to, in the appendix, put this sort of categorize the quotes that we thought were, very indicative of what people were saying that centered around the theme. So you can, I don't know if that's where you picked up some of the tone of maybe what was said and how people were feeling. And I do think that is reflected in some of those quotes in the appendix. If you haven't had a chance to look at that, you're absolutely welcome to. But, just being in the room with the police officers, I would say, yes, there was definitely a lot of concern, especially among the supervisors, about a number of things. So one thing they were concerned about was just the timing of this whole process, right? Because it happened in the aftermath of George Floyd and a lot of other events, national events that had been headlined, and the Black Lives Matter movement, and the defund the police movement that sort of sprung up. So I think that they sort of felt this was a little bit of a unique time frame that this happened in. So they were a little skeptical that maybe think things are appearing a little more negative than they might otherwise be. And of course, they might be right about that, but the point is they were a little bit concerned about that issue. Another issue that they were concerned about is, I'm really sad, I think sad and frustrated and disappointed about, is just, the effects that have been felt, that they feel on a daily basis as a result of some of the events that have happened nationally, the reporting in the media, the social media, and really a lot of anti-police sentiment that they feel. And, some of the frontline officers actually reported that they get called all sorts of names, on a daily basis, that they just feel that they didn't used to, have happen. People just shouting at them as being racist and other kind of very critical comments that they felt really concerned about. And they don't think it's anything that they're doing differently. They think it really has to do with society and how society has sort of been changing, in the last 2, 3, 5 years. So that really concerned them quite a bit. And I'll just share one one quick anecdote, because it was just, for me, very profound just listening to this. There's one police officer who said, I'm a big brother. I have a little brother. He's African American. I've been his big brother for at least what I remember 2 or 3 years. So we've had this long-term relationship. I have a good relationship with his mother as well. And the mother called me up and said, can you please talk to my son, because he's really feeling very negative about the police generally, and even to some extent about his relationship with you. And that was so disappointing to the police officer. He was just really sort of floored by that, and he did. He spent a lot of time talking to the young man and saying, look, I'm the same person I was yesterday. I'm the same person I was, a year ago, and you know who I am. We've gotten to be friends. So what you're seeing, nationally, I understand why it upsets you, but don't make the assumption that every police officer is like this. And it was just a very, heartfelt story about how challenging it is for the police. So they experience these things, and they, from my perspective, from what I heard, get very frustrated and sad, and I think it's a morale issue. And they didn't come out and say this is a morale issue, but you could just tell that they were very frustrated. I mean, if I had to use one word to characterize the tone of those police focus groups, it was frustrated with a lot of things. So I don't know if I answered your question there.
Eric, maybe, you've got a number of findings in there, and there were a number of areas where there are potential recommendations and follow-ups. Were there any that you thought we ought to pay particular attention to, whether it was residents' ideas for improving police-community relations or others? Were there any things that, as you looked at survey comments, some of the listening session results, and the focus groups, that you think bear review and discussion at this task force level? You or April?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and I wonder if April has some thoughts, but I'll start out by saying I want to make sure that you understand that if there are any recommendations in that Phase 3 report, these are recommendations that came from the voices of the residents. So we are not, just so you know, April and I or any of the research team, we are not endorsing any particular recommendations. But we thought, to be true to the residents, we wanted to make sure that their views were represented. So, for example, they came up with, a couple ideas, like we think there should be more language competence somehow, and that's a tricky one. Like, how do you do that efficiently and effectively? And I don't have any, expertise in that, so I really don't know what to tell you. But that was a common thread that we heard. Another one was this idea of cultural competence that came up, and it wasn't just about Hmong culture, although that was certainly a recurring theme among the Hmong population that we interviewed. But there was also gay and lesbian culture and gender identity culture. There was issues around how to better deal with young people. So it was a more broad concept of what cultural competence might mean, and some of the residents felt that the police could use some training in cultural competence. The anti-bias training, that came up. That was kind of a recurring theme. And again, I'm not saying, I don't think our research team is recommending this at all. We just wanted to make sure that that common recurring idea was in the report, because we did hear that from the residents themselves. So, I mean, as far as like our recommendations, I mean, we're trying not to make the recommendation because we feel like that's your job. But I would say personally, if I had to say one thing, I would say, for me, the biggest takeaway, which I think I mentioned earlier, is just that there are some perception gaps. I think that's the way I'd like to phrase it, between a subset of residents who tend to think a little more negatively toward the police for a variety of reasons, whether they're young people, whether they're LGBTQ, whether they're people with mental health challenges. you know, I'm not saying that that's true of every person in this category, but, you know, obviously they feel slightly more negatively towards the police than other populations. And a lot of that more negative feeling, I think, is about perceptions and gaps in perceptions. And, you know, and when I was talking, I hope I'm not throwing anybody under the bus here, but when I was talking, for example, with the police chief about a couple of the findings in the report, you know, he pointed out, well, you know, we're actually doing these things, Eric. You know, like another recommendation that the residents came up with was hiring diverse officers. And, you know, and I think the chief pointed out that, look, we're kind of a leader in the state around, you know, really trying to attract and retain diverse officers. But for some reason, there's a perception gap among some residents that maybe the Wausau police are not making an effort here when in fact they really are. So from my perspective, it's really about how, you know, which of these perception gaps are serious enough that you think that might require some kind of action. What that action is, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure what that would be, but that would be sort of my takeaway. I'm going to stop there. April, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. And I have my hand raised. Let me see if I can get it down here. And one of my reactions was in response to Pat's question about the felt negativity or reaction or defensiveness on behalf of some of the quotes seen by the police officers. And I think some of that is, you know, they were asked questions that I think brought that out. So one of the questions was about how positive many of the survey respondents were, but that there were people who had negative voices and felt that they were experiencing, you know, negativity and aggressive behavior from officers, and you know, in the focus groups, the police officers were asked their thoughts on that, and they had another question, which was, you know, who's responsible for how the interaction goes? So I think they were asked the types of questions that may have enabled or facilitated, you know, that frustration to be able to for us to see it. You know, I think about, Eric, your description of perception gaps, and it's related to what I was thinking, which is that, you know, people, I think residents go into interactions with, you know, they're thinking about how the officers behave toward them, and the officers are thinking about how the residents behave toward them. And I think we all feel like we're responsive to how people behave toward us, but we also all go into any type of situation with expectancies. And I'm guessing that the expectancies that are operating between officers and residents in some situations, and for some people more than others, may be more of a gap than otherwise, than other situations. And in fact, you know, we know that some people, just like in terms of personality differences, some people are more prone to view other people's behavior as aggressive or as hostile. And I think when you're dealing with unfamiliar situations, or you're dealing with a situation that is entirely negative, right, that you could have those expectancies operating in both directions. And I'm not saying that there's a solution to this. I'm just saying I think it's a really complicated interaction going, and it could be happening both ways, right? So it's like, you know, we don't need to take the police officer side, we don't need to take the resident side, but rather those expectancies and perceptions of others' behaviors operate all the time, where, you know, 5 people watch the same person's behavior and they all interpret it slightly differently. So anyway, another final thought I had is related to implicit bias training, and I'm not offering a recommendation here, but the literature in psychology is really debating this right now, and there's a lot of research out there at this point that suggests, at least in corporations, diversity training is not working and hasn't worked since the 70s. There is a huge debate about the what is implicit bias, the construct itself. Can we actually measure these implicit attitudes? So people toss around this term implicit bias all the time, and in psychology it's a really murky concept right now. So if I were to make a recommendation, it would be like, if you're going to do implicit bias training, really, really do your research on what kind of program you might implement that actually has some solid evidence behind it.
Mike?
So I've got several takeaways, from reading through this, and, surprisingly, the comments I thought were very additive. Sometimes in surveys like this, they're not very helpful, or they're just kind of flippant, but I thought they were substantive and really helped the base of what you guys did, so I appreciate that. But John, I'm just going to go through, several takeaways and kind of thoughts for actions, and if you want to jot them down and we can circle back to them, I think that'd probably be more cogent for everybody. But, first off, Eric, I do appreciate your comments. I've always found you to be very perceptive and insightful in any, interaction or issue that we've been ever talking through. So I do appreciate the feedback that you have. In April, you've been incredible, and I think the work does speak for itself within the reports. And anybody that would like to pick these things up could take it and see what we're doing and why we want to do it, and just appreciate, again, all that you're doing. My first takeaway as I go through this is, and you started both reports with this, is that by and large, we're doing a really good job here in Wausau. And I think we need to continue to emphasize that and realize that we're not going to have 100% positive interactions at any time. That's not realistic. So it becomes a matter of what our tolerance is for, the matter of degree and frequency that people are having a negative experience. And so 75 to 80% of the community believes that we're doing a great job. And what we find is that there are differences in some groups relative to just natural, population base here, that we need to make a better conservative effort to reach out to, understand why they feel that way, and continue to engage those communities. You've identified them in this report, and I think we should be tasking our department to continue to outreach, continue to find ways to train, and to educate officers about how we can create better interactions with these populations that clearly there's a statistically significant difference in their experience with the department. Whether that's as a result of our department of itself or a result of people, just national conversation. The other thing that, I take away from this, and in my experience with the Wausau PD, is that the reality, and maybe they could just start saying this as in terms of educating the community about policing, but my experience is they don't want to arrest you and they don't want to take you to jail. There's some things they have to arrest you for, and there's some things they have to take you to jail for, but when we talk about behavior, and in the report it said 99% of what we do is reactive. An officer said that, and I believe that, and I think that as we go forward, educating the community, starting with our high school students about how to interact with law enforcement, what are our expectations when law enforcement interacts with you, could go a long way, not only in building relationships, but then also understanding how we can, get to better outcomes, because that is a population that does not feel safe with law enforcement. And I think it's by and large driven by, things that are happening nationally, and certainly things that are coming across in the national media that makes them feel unsafe. The impact of social media affecting attitude is substantial, not only in this issue, but just in everything. I can't relate to this issue as much because I'm a white male, but I can empathize with what I think some people in our community are dealing with here. And a related thing as it relates to the power of social media, and I don't know how we get our hands around it other than to continue to combat some of this stuff directly through social media channels. But last week, there was threats against violence, in schools all across the nation. And look what it did to the psyches of young individuals in our communities all across this nation. I mean, that was completely a fabricated type event that happened. I've got a first grader that, we had the conversation before she went to school, and she said, yeah, we can't live in fear, Dad. We can't live in fear. I mean, so she totally understood what we were doing, but then went to the school nurse halfway through the day and was in tears and wanted to come home because she didn't feel safe, with violence. So the power of social media, the power of the media in people's minds cannot be understated. but that doesn't diminish what real people are experiencing in our community, and that we need to address those things where there's disparities and injustices that are happening. But there is a lot that is brought into this conversation that is outside of this local community, and this report continues to emphasize that. And I think that we need to embrace our police department as a model citizen amongst law enforcement across the country. That doesn't mean they're perfect, but we need to continue to lead and embrace what great policing can look like, because I think that it's really impacting people's perceptions from national sources. Enhancing mental health training, I think there's a lot of conversation about, this defunding the police and taking social elements of the job out of the day-to-day interactions of police. I think that's important, but it's not realistic either. I mean, we're never going to completely pull that out. We certainly shouldn't be replacing officers, but we should be adding to departments and their resources with mental health professionals, social workers of those natures. But we do need to continue to work towards providing better training for mental health, regardless of whether or not that's a role police provides, because often they're the ones that are going to see it first or interact. Implicit bias, I do think, is an important one, in terms of training going forward. In terms of officer wellness, we need a new EAP provider. I mean, that's clear from this report. And, if we want to talk about mental health parity, I would encourage the city to look at changing the way that we pay for mental health care. President Bush, nearly 2 decades ago, made mental health parity a law in this nation, and we're still far, far away from it. And I think mental health visits should be on the same scale as going to see your preventative doctor for your annual visits. I mean, we shouldn't be having costs be something that's an obstruction to people's mental health care in any facet. And I think it'd have positive implications for the city in both presenteeism and absenteeism and overall health claims. And then culture competence, in terms of communication, I would encourage the department to look at bringing in resources to train basic commands and questions in Hmong and Spanish. I mean, those are the dominant languages in our community. It's not that they all have to speak it fluently, but if there were some key elements that we could train so that they could at least, de-escalate, that was clear, that helps de-escalate in those situations, just some basic interaction. And then I think we already made a recommendation on effective interpreters. And then lastly, community engagement, again, just continue to reach out to those populations that don't have the same experience as the majority of people in Wausau do, and understand where that's coming from and how we can work together. But then also, there was this theme that came up in the comments about people not feeling safe coming to the Wausau PD because they're not going to have their crime be considered, or that they don't think that something will happen with it. I think the police department already does this in some respects, but we have resources within the department with mental health therapists. I think there's a victim resource coordinator that's in the department, and some other social service staff. And to the extent we can maybe offer outreach, maybe they're already doing intakes with those staff members already for, let's say, a domestic violence case, or somebody that has a smaller crime committed against them. But somebody within the department that can have a different approach maybe in the intake, and then do outreach for people to feel comfortable reaching out to the department to have kind of their story told and potentially follow up. I mean, that's something that I don't know the extent of that being done, but was a solution that had popped into my head. So those were some of the things I took away from this. I mean, we've made some recommendations already, but again, I think the report is very comprehensive, and there's a lot, I think, that we can do to make this department even better than it already is.
Other thoughts, takeaways, because that's really driving our discussion going forward. Any others?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I echo a lot of what Michael said. But again, like you said, the impact of social media in terms of, thinking about how we reach people, especially young people that are affected. We really just have to be, and I know that the police department does quite a bit of interaction on social media. But we're gonna, but I think in reviewing those methods and looking at if there's other opportunities to use that, or maybe as a way to signal other types of outreach, I think would be helpful, because there's no getting around that, especially with sort of the younger population. And from where, in looking at the survey, and I will say, as he said, overall, the survey was incredibly positive regarding the police officers. They do an incredible job. But in terms of certain groups within our community and the interactions, certainly that's definitely one method that has to be utilized more in terms of information and possibly as a way to advertise outreach. I think, in terms of looking at things like that were mentioned, enhancing mental health training. I think we had talked about recommendations regarding that before. That came out through, I think, a number of our meetings as something very important in terms of the officers and in terms of how how the public views those issues. Talk about effective, as you mentioned, effective interpreters, but also just making sure, I think, that we communicate better, because I think through this process, a lot of the things that we, when we talk about policies and other things, the police are doing, and so I think if anything, one of the things that obviously that I think there's more opportunity to do is to really look at ways to better communicate the things that the police are doing, and opportunities for education on that end as well, and more interaction with the public in terms of opportunities to engage. I know, and obviously with COVID, it has made some things difficult. One of the things that the Wausau police did that I thought was really great, which hopefully, I know numbers look like they're rising again, but hopefully at some point, like the Citizen Academy, I think it's really important for citizens to get sort of a view of kind of what goes on and to participate in an environment that I think is productive. So overall, I think WIPS did an excellent job with this survey, and certainly a number of the recommendations we've talked about, I think pretty dead on, and I think Michael kind of stole most of the thunder, because I think he was right on as well in terms of the overall takeaways. Thank you.
Pat, any?
One small thought I had was that I thought it was telling, and I guess it's human nature, and it probably would be in any group that you approach, but it seemed to me, and I know we're not supposed to draw broad conclusions from the comments of a few representatives of the police department, but they did seem to fairly consistently say that when there's an incident, they come into it without bias, and if it goes to hell, it's because of, and I'm simplifying here, if it goes to hell, it's because of the citizens sends it there. It's their attitude. And that bothered me a little bit, probably a lot of truth to it, but might be something that would warrant some discussion among the ranks. But I agree with the other gentleman. I think we are doing very, very well. I think we need to keep working. I think it's a legitimate statement from April that maybe some of this diversity training isn't all it's cracked up to be, but I think that the fact that you're having the discussions and bringing these things out to be talked about in a group setting with your people is helpful. So I think we need to continue to make that effort and keep pushing on it and let the personnel in the department know that this is something that's important to us.
Mike?
I think that, we're highlighting some key parts. You sort of look at this sort of in a triangle for me, right? We've had experts and people who are actively involved in different systems of the bigger police justice system come and present. And so that's sort of one side of the triangle. And then you have the quantitative stats part, which is another side of the triangle. And then you have the qualitative, and the focus groups, which is another side of this triangle. And together, you sort of, where they're all crossing, and you see commonality, I think is the key part to sort of bring up. And we've talked about mental health, both for officers and for, how do we respond to it? I think throughout this, we can go through to a really micro level and pull things, but at some point, there's how many recommendations and where is our main focus points? I think that everyone is highlighted on stuff. I think about, the ability of social media affecting attitudes, and I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about, the snowball YouTube, Facebook post, and, how powerful that was. And then, so how can you deal with, for example, where there's concerns coming out on what happens if an officer does something wrong, what's the response? How can you connect a weakness in transparency or a weakness in understanding to a strength that our system already has? And to encourage, that type of reality, and that type of realm. We talked about Friday, with all these incidences. My girls, I've got two daughters at East, and they had a tragedy with a faculty member passing, and both of the therapy dogs were there, and that power of connecting with those unique opportunities, the strengths we have, can be used at some level, some hope, perhaps, to address some of the struggles the younger generation, the younger cohort, as Michael was sort of saying, how are we getting into there? How are we getting into the high schools and stuff? As that develops more, by essence, I think it'll be a benefit, but I also think to be some intentionality behind it would be things to invest some time and effort into.
Haley? Let me just share some of my thoughts. I think one of the takeaways that I have is that people are informed in many ways, and it's important that we have a multifaceted approach to communicating with the public. And I think, social media drives many. It doesn't drive all. I was amazed at how Channel 9 was number one relative to where people get their information, and Wausau Pilot Review was up there. And I think it's important for us to understand the dynamics of how people are informed and get their information. And that's critical for an effective communication strategy. One of the things that I learned through this process was that, and I'll pick up on what April and Eric said to begin this, there is no uniformity in groups. And, whether it's Hispanics, a Puerto Rican Hispanic is much different relative to their views of law enforcement than Latinx from Central America, because some may be documented, and Puerto Ricans are citizens of this country, and therefore their trust in the system and their fear of the system is different. And when we talk about one of the reasons why people fear coming in is it may be their immigration status, and we have to have an awareness of that going forward. I'm glad we focused in on the mental health services, and one of the things that we learned too was that there were social needs, and it gets into that issue, the homeless population, and we what is the role of the police department when it comes to addressing those special circumstances and in needs, and in the past they've had a leadership role, but that's not sustainable. Is there a different group that needs to step in some of those cases? And then the whole issue of cultural competence, I think is one that we need to make sure that we're aware of. And I'll single out the Hmong community in particular with their reliance upon the clans for their structure and order, and our understanding of their desire to handle domestic abuse situations in particular through the clan structure runs counter to the state statutes and the responsibility of the officers to protect. But it's a fundamental one, so I think that area calls out for an expanded dialogue, engagement with the Hmong leaders and others. And I think we've been, as a community, impacted tragically in a couple of cases relative to domestic abuse within that community. And I would hope that we could look at adopting the neighbor-to-neighbor like concept with the clan leaders and others to better strengthen those ties. But again, I want to echo a couple of things. One, appreciation for the work that WIPS has done throughout this process and in guiding us with the listening sessions, facilitating those meetings, designing and assembling the results of the survey and focusing on critical issues and critical groups through the focus group process. I think it has led us to a place where we have better understanding of the general public in the broad sense, and some of the, if you will, the marginalized community, or those that have a different viewpoint and perspective, and helping to understand those. At the end of the day, I think it leads to a better understanding of where people come from. And I'm very appreciative of the work that they've done, and I think they might, with this process, actually be done with our report, unless people want to see some changes to it. But I think that they have presented, they have done what we have tasked them to do. They have presented it in a concise manner, and the chief, the mayor, and I have had an opportunity to see drafts, and we asked for it to be shortened, remove some of the redundancy, and make it, I think, a little bit more focused. And they've done an excellent job of responding to those comments. And we now need to focus in on where do we go from here. Our job is to make a series of recommendations and priorities. And getting at Mike Kemp North's comment is that I think we can make multiple recommendations, but I think at the end of the day, we need to try to prioritize which ones we think would be the most meaningful in the context of making changes for the community and for law enforcement in general. Anybody else have any questions for Eric or April?
I do have one other sort of takeaway from this, and so I take April's comments well in terms of in talking about diversity training, but I think from my standpoint, as we talked about like cultural competence, and looking at some of the reactions, like Pat mentioned, in terms of reactions from the police in terms of saying that, a lot of times it's reactionary, and then looking at some of the comments as well from some of the community members, like there was one from a gentleman identified himself as Hispanic and talking about his experiences from this country. I think some of the reaction, as we had talked about, is based on sort of, their history and background and culture. And so if we completely move past sort of any kind of training or education on that, now we can look at what type of training is more appropriate or what would be more effective. But I think our recommendations have to include some sort of path forward, because to not deal with that, and that is why there is sort of, I think, this divide, on within some of those groups because of their experiences. If we don't deal with how to understand those, then that is why we have some differences, because we all come in with some bias a little bit. So if police are coming in and sort of they're looking at the situation from one end, and they don't have maybe an understanding on that end of, let's say, sort of in terms of the Klan leaders and their background, or the Hispanic members coming in who are from, a different country, and this person is reacting in a certain way, their reaction is going to be to the reaction that they see. And then what ends up happening is sort of both end up missing each other, I think, in some of these reactions. But if the police come in with sort of an understanding of some of the background in terms of education on that end, and we create opportunities for some of those community members to get more education in terms of those interactions, I think it'll be helpful. I will say myself, when we did some mock training in terms of how to interact with the police, one of the things I said I think I said it to the chief, was that I myself didn't really know how to react when I was pulled over. My reaction had always been, because and I grew up with members of my family in the police force and in the sheriff's department, but my reaction was always try to hurry up and get everything out of the glove compartment as fast as possible so that my hands stay where they are and they don't have to worry about that, and I don't have to worry about, what might happen. But then, talking to Chief Bliven, he mentioned, obviously if we're pulling up and if we can see in there that you're scrambling for stuff, we might think you're trying to get something. And just having that understanding, I was like, yeah, that actually makes sense. But I could see where I'm doing one thing, they're thinking another thing, and then that interaction, because, my sort of background in terms of history, I did grow up, even having that background in law enforcement, we had to talk. But, so my experiences are different, and so they influence how I react. And without sort of that understanding, we would maybe miss each other in that interaction if it was with a police officer. And so I think there has to be something we need to discuss in terms of talking about how we move forward on that end. It might not have to look like the, regular implicit bias training, because what we want is something that's going to be meaningful. But we need to definitely look at some path forward on that end, I think. Thank you.
Other comments or questions for Eric or April? If not, again, on behalf of the task force, I want to thank you for a job well done, and your countless hours. I know we were probably well over budget in terms of how many hours we wound up taking from you, so we appreciate the contributions, and we look forward to maybe doing a check-in in the future, but thank you so much for your efforts, and you're welcome to stay for the rest of the meeting or go on with your life. So, thank you.
Thank
We
you.
really appreciate having had the opportunity to work with all of you, and just know that if in the next however length of time you're deliberating around recommendations, if there's any other things that we can answer or address regarding the reports, obviously not the recommendations, but the reports, just feel free to shout out or give us a call or something.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you.
All right, we will move on now. At the last meeting, one of the issues that came up that you wanted additional clarity for was review the citizens' engagement process and opportunities. What's allowed under the current statutes, mayoral oversight, how do we use neighbor-to-neighbor meetings and the complaint process and citizen surveys. And the chief is going to give us an overview. We've covered these in the past, but I think that I sensed at the last meeting that there was a desire for us to have a perhaps better understanding. And I know the mayor is she heading down? I assume because she dropped off that perhaps she's heading down for this. But Ben, if you want to come up.
You want me to talk about the citizen complaint process again? Is that's what you want me to address right now?
Sure, and you know, yes.
Can I give my reactions to the discussion that you guys had? Is that all right? Acceptable to the task
Sure.
force? Usually I'm pretty measured, I think, when I come up here and speak. And so, you know, maybe some of the things I've said have given the wrong impression about how our team feels about this task force and how our team feels about the scrutiny they've been under for the last 18 months. You know, I don't think there should be any surprise from anybody in the community or on this task force that our team is frustrated with the scrutiny with which they have lived over the last 18 months. You know, they go out into this community on a daily basis. Sometimes they get called to places, and the very caller that called for help is the one berating them, calling them names and racist, and they don't even know them, and they're just there to help. And that's frustrating. And so, you know, when the task force did a survey, the survey said 85% of our community thinks we're doing an excellent job or a good job. 85% of the community. But then we said, okay, but this subset of the community, we want to delve deep into those things too. And that's hard for our police officers. It's hard for me to actually understand and really take into consideration when, you know, we're under such scrutiny. So I don't think it should be a surprise that officers were defensive by the way the questions were asked and by the environment that we're living in right now. And I think in regards to the citizen behavior driving our contact, I can tell you I've reviewed many citizen complaints, many videos that were internal investigations, and I can tell you 99% of the time, maybe more, are, you know, situations that don't go as planned are the result of citizen behavior. It's the result of how people interact with police. We don't go in there with a intimidating mindset. And a good example is I had a citizen complaint just last week. An officer made a traffic stop, and the citizen got out of the car. The officer was talking with the citizen, and they later called. The citizen got a warning for a defective taillight. The citizen called and filed a complaint. The citizen came down to the police department, talked to the lieutenant, and said, the officer was aggressive, and I was scared, and I don't appreciate it. So the lieutenant said, well, let's watch the video. They pull up the body camera footage and watched it with the citizen complainant. And the citizen complainant said, well, they don't appear to be aggressive, but that's how I felt. So I understand that people are intimidated sometimes and concerned with how law enforcement looks. Our uniform can be intimidating, and just I understand the power dynamic in that relationship, but that doesn't mean that the police officers are acting aggressive just because somebody felt like they were acting aggressive. So that's a good example of how sometimes the actions of officers are not perceived when you watch the video. They're perceived differently. So I wanted to put that information out there. I think it's important for our officers, for you to know how our officers feel and how things have been viewed over the last 18 months within our department, and I think within our profession. So I can talk about, unless there's any reaction to that or any questions in response to that, I can talk about our citizen complaint process.
Why don't we go through the process?
So we have a robust policy on citizen complaints. The policy is that anytime a citizen calls and files a complaint, whether it is a formal written complaint or not, we will investigate that complaint. We will document the complaint, and we will, and then route it through up to me to review the incident, and then we'll make a determination as to whether or not we have bad policy, whether or not the officer needs training or coaching, or whether or not the officer acted inappropriately and there needs to be discipline. That process, I document that. I have a spreadsheet that documents every citizen complaint that we have, whether it's formal or informal. We also have expectations of our officers, every line officer and all of our supervisors, where if they witness an officer violating policy, acting inappropriately, that they report that so that we can start an internal investigation. So many times when we're doing an investigation into an officer's behavior, it's the result of an officer or a supervisor bringing that to the attention of somebody that can do the investigation. It's not just from citizen complaints. The Police and Fire Commission, by statute, has authority over the discipline of police officers. That includes the termination of police officers. So the way it works in Wausau and the Police and Fire Commission, we have two commissioners here that can speak to this if they'd like. But the process is that I make the determination for discipline. If I make a determination that an officer is going to be suspended without pay, then I will notify the Police and Fire Commission in case there is an appeal by the officer to the Police and Fire Commission. If there is an offense committed by an officer that I think requires termination, then I don't have the authority to terminate an officer. I would file charges with the Police and Fire Commission, who then can hold a public hearing on the charges and the investigation into that officer's conduct. And I do an annual report and review of all of our citizen complaints and the outcomes to look for any themes or patterns with specific officers or supervisors within those investigations, or themes of conduct within our department that needs to be evaluated or rectified as well. That's a pretty broad overview, but it's a robust policy that I think we've talked about here before, and we've gone through how that works.
I forget who raised that issue at the last meeting, but was that what you were looking for? I don't know, the mayor would like, they have comments about her authority, so do you want to come on up?
Sure, I can share what I do. So in the Police and Fire Commission handbook, if something's filed against an officer or the chief that requires the PFC to investigate, they might decide that they need to hand it over to me to investigate, which would likely mean I would need to get a team together to do that. So that's part of the Police and Fire Commission, what's written in the statutes, right? But pretty much day to day, both fire chief and police chief do report to me. I'm responsible for feedback. Like any kind of manager would be doing. I'm responsible for giving them annual reviews and, just kind of your standard, leadership type stuff. So I don't know if there are questions about that, but
Okay.
I know it's part of this whole process here. Okay.
Other questions relative to the authorities? Okay, thank you. Next, we'll move on, discuss possible recommendations. Let me go back, and Michael started the process of identifying the takeaways, but let me see if I can capture, and please correct me if I misspeak or if you want to add anything. But what I heard was in terms of mental health, and I'm going to embellish a little bit in here, that we had the concerns over the need for training for officers. We had the issue of response, And what didn't come up formally tonight was that whole issue of the CART expansion. And we've talked about that in the past. In that whole issue of how do we support the officer in the field. Then we also heard the issue of mental health from the perspective of the officer in the context of EAP services. And the ability to support that officer in their job, in the need to do that. So those were within the mental health. Have I captured the issue of training? We've heard that issue of, well, other people should respond. The problem is that the 911 call comes in, and the first person on the scene is an officer, unless it's triaged by the dispatcher, which generally it's not. The officer may be going out alone. If it is known, I think you try to send the CART team if available. Mike?
I'll make an attempt to make two motions out of what you just covered, in addition to the ones we've already taken action on. At this point, we've taken action on expanding CART. We've taken actions on expanding or recommending social work to continue the homelessness. The two things that I would suggest come out of this is, and I don't want to prescribe exactly how this is accomplished because I trust the department through their demonstrated activity and efforts over the years that I've been involved with them, that I know they'll do this to the degree that it makes sense and then actually enhances it. The first thing I would say is I would recommend that the department continue to enhance its mental health training as part of in-service training to officers. That would be my first motion. Because I don't know if CIT or the other version is enough, but I trust that if we make a recommendation that they continue to invest resources to expand what they do in in-service training relative to mental health, it will make improvements. So that'd be my motion.
Second that.
Any discussion?
So is this, I think from what I heard from Chief Bliven, and some of this is not just what they want to do, but the encouragement of funding sources, of allocation of resources to give them the ability. I think, Chief Bliven might be like, yeah, you guys, we need to do more of this, but that comes at a cost. Is this the appropriate time and place to also identify that that recommendation needs to be, it's either included in this recommendation, or is that a secondary to give them the tools to achieve our recommendation? It's not fair to say, do this, but do this with no more funding, no more staff time, whatever. That would be my...
John, ultimately, the recommendations, if I can, are going to the city council, and that ultimately the city council is going to have to make this decision. So, I mean, I would, if somebody wants to do amendment, the recommendation to the city council would be that the Wausau Police Department be given the ability or pursues the ability to expand their mental health training as part of their in-services, and that the city council consider funding any requisite additional expense to accomplish such initiatives or something to that effect. I don't know if that helps.
That is an amendment? Is that the intent?
Pat, does that help or not?
It almost seems like it goes without saying that, we're saying do this, and you're also included the fact that you trust that, they're able to figure out how to attack this. Mm-hmm. So I think it goes without saying that they would figure out, okay, we need $3,000, to bring in 2 speakers or whatever, and then include that in their budget request, or make a special budget request when they're prepared to do so. So I don't know if you need to get all detailed on it.
The original motion was silent relative to the funding, with the expectation that the city council would prioritize this. Mike Kemp North, is that acceptable?
I guess I I get worried, I mean, right, I'm not on the city council, I'm not in the process. But we're gathered here to make recommendations to the city as a whole. And at some point, to identify to the city council that some of this is a recommendation to them from us of a change in action. And it's not just the police department coming and saying, because the police task force, I don't know, this is where I'm not on the city council. I just would feel that at some level identifying resources need to be allocated would be pertinent.
Hello. We do this all the time with our committee structure, right? HR committee will say, hey, we want to do this thing. Finance, please figure out how we fund it. It's not a guarantee that all of these recommendations, obviously you can't actually create policy that the city will enact, but the recommendations will be taken seriously. They authorized the creation of this task force. They approved of all your appointments. They have been asking for updates on this process. So I guess if that makes you feel better or worse, I don't know.
So we have a motion, we have a concern expressed, but we don't have any amendment to it. So-
Could you review the motion? Maybe we can make a minor modification.
John, I don't know if, sorry, before you do that.
That's fine.
If we're just going to put together like a whole recommendation list, maybe there's just something at the bottom of that list that the city council funds, the department puts forward the funding request for all these recommendations that the city council considers in additional allocations to accomplish these objectives.
So let
Something like that.
me review our process. So we have 2 additional meetings scheduled, January 10th and January 31st. The intent was to try to advance concepts to that report, both today and in the 10th, and on the 31st, basically approve that report. The intent would then be to present the report to the Public Safety Committee, and then ultimately the City Council and the Police and Fire Commission. There is a requirement for a public hearing. I think that's on us sometime in the future. We haven't quite worked out the logistics of that. But I think, my experience, Mike, is it the more we get into trying to identify specific funding sources, the more likely we are to sink the ship. And I think that it's within the context of priorities for the city. We've been charged as the mayor said, by the mayor and the council to develop recommendations. I think we can, as Michael said, I'll put that footnote on the bottom relative to expectation of funding,
Sounds good?
if that makes sense.
That works.
All right, any other discussion? If not, all's in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Is it Mike?
Then I'll do the second one, which is, I would recommend that the city consider amending its health plan to enhance its mental health benefits for all city staff, but specifically officer wellness. Please consider it.
Do you want to specify that the goal would be to have mental health, are you talking mental health or EAP?
Both. The way I've looked at EAP, that's more of a screening tool
Okay,
for people to first reach out, but then ongoing mental health, if you read the report, it was not the problem necessarily of getting screened, but it was the ongoing needs and not being paid for and having to take time off for it. I mean, just to address mental health benefits under the employee health plan.
there's also the issue of finding professionals who maybe had some law enforcement experience or specialization. Do you want to include something along that, or is that kind of included in the concept?
Yeah. If we can find the coverage, then we can find the people. You know what I mean? So I think the coverage is probably the more predominant concern of mine, is let's cover it adequately and then find the people that are adequate.
So again,
I just have a quick question on that one. And not that I'm against enhancing funding for all city employees, but I have a question in terms of our recommendations, aren't they supposed to be specific to the police and their staff?
that was my concern, because I think the price tag grows exponentially when we include all employees. And we were talking about, sort of that PSTT concept. So would you like to reframe, absent a second, you have the editorial ability to reframe?
I'd make a motion that the city expand mental health resources for law enforcement officers.
And I'll amend law enforcement officers and their staff.
We don't have a second, so is that law enforcement?
Members of the Wausau Police Department.
I'll second.
All right, any discussion on that motion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? That motion carries. Let me just, we may be revisiting some of these motions for clarification when we start getting into trying to prepare that, because I heard a couple of things, and if we think that there's ambiguity when, in developing those recommendations, we'll bring it back for clarification, if that's okay. Any thoughts on, are we prepared to take, well, we had other discussions relative to the whole concept of, generally, the police are doing a good job in the community. Do we want to, in our findings, I think that my intent would be to try to capture that in the findings and the strengths of the department. I don't know that we need a motion on that at this time, but we will make sure that we capture that concept. And Michael, you had brought that up as a takeaway. The whole issue of expectations, when law enforcement works with them, we've talked about the responsibilities of the officers and the expectations, but we've also talked about the potential expectations of citizens. Are we in a position to take a position today?
I would make it really simple and just say, I'd make a motion that the police department explore basically a public service campaign or public communication, I don't know what you want to call it, a communication campaign about interacting with law enforcement for positive outcomes. Just to use whatever channels they can with a specific focus on young adults and school kids. My motions are not eloquent, but I'm trying to get the gist of it.
I'd be a second on that one.
Moved and seconded. And Gene, you get the challenge of transcribing these. Thank you. All right.
Read that back right now?
Well, my police department explore a communications campaign on positive outcomes for,
Interact with law enforcement to achieve positive
yeah.
outcomes with the younger generation.
And I'll just offer, I mean, this is obviously on video. We can go back and, kind of clarify it. But then the second thing is, my expectation would be that all of this is going to be summarized, and we're going to see this final document. So if we err in how this is acted on, we can correct it
Yep.
before the finals are done.
Yep.
So this is just to move it along.
All right, any discussion? If not,
Yeah.
I'll,
Yeah.
Well-
I love that idea. Although, I guess just putting it out there, do we want this to be maybe a little bit of a series of public service sort of ads out there, not just dealing with sort sort of teens, but as we had just mentioned, I guess that would kind of go toward what when we're talking about sort of interactions with, different types of populations. Maybe we might want to think about that being sort of, a series in terms of developing positive outcomes with, different types of communities.
Is that an amendment, or is it a desire to explore that in more detail?
I guess before I make that amendment, I would like to get some feedback from the rest of the commission.
Yeah, again, I think we're best served by giving kind of broad directives and then empowering the department to do those. I agree with you, that is part of this, but whatever way they see fit in interacting with the public and through their channels, just with the general concept of enhancing interactions, I agree with you, but I don't know if it has to be an amendment.
Well, I guess then I would say if we're going that route, then we would just say overall public outcomes and take out the focus on teens. So either we add the teens and then we say other groups, or we just say in general, I think.
I think we need to find a happy medium between micromanaging the department and putting out abstract, random comments as a task force that said, increase your public awareness. And then the public's like, congratulations, you did all this and that's what you got from it. I think there's some more, whether it be we increase public awareness in topics and demographic groups highlighted within our findings or something. I think there needs to be some connection to what we're sort of finding.
I have something to add to. I don't really like the idea of putting focus on young people. We keep coming back to that, but I just feel like we keep trying to convince young people or something that, I don't know, the police are trustworthy and I don't know. I just don't feel like it's necessary. I know that the younger population, with the results and everything, there was concerns, but I don't know. I guess I just don't see that as being super pertinent to include. But that's just me as a young person, I guess.
Can we perhaps, while we think about this one, put this in a parking lot for the next meeting while we look at it, and we'll put that on there?
I can park my feelings on this too.
But go ahead, if you,
Nope, I will be ready. I'll be even more eloquent then.
so why don't we carry this meeting, because I think we've got another meeting to really do that, so we'll flag that as an issue, specific issue.
I think what could happen along those lines would be for the committee to, with the motion, to make some kind of a statement about our thoughts and what went into the making of the motion and what we'd like to see come out of it. Kind of a synopsis, or I don't know what you'd call it, but
We might need a little bit more detailed minutes to capture some of this discussion for.
But I think when this comes out, maybe some work could be done on, here's what we were thinking on this, and what led to us. And here, city council, is why we think you ought to pass this motion that we bringing to you.
All right, we'll bring that back at the next meeting. And we've heard the concerns about the need for clarity, the concerns about signaling out a group or subset. The issue of cultural competencies came up. And that has a faceted issue. Any thoughts on how we address the issue of cultural competencies? We've heard the concept of communication. We've heard the concept of education. We've heard others. Or do you want to think about that one and we could frame some options for the next meeting.
To me, this is, again, a training kind of recommendation to encourage communicating with different cultures, just enhancing that, whether it's actual language skills, some basic language skills, or the use of interpreters, or the use of just awareness. Yeah, I think we probably should sit on that one a little bit, but that was the idea behind it.
Anybody averse to bringing that back in with a little bit more clarity and for the next meeting? All right, we'll carry that one over. I apologize for going back and forth, but the whole issue, we had the issue of communication that came out, and with a heavy emphasis on trying to address social media and be responsive to it. But again, the survey results show that people, there's age variability, but people get their information from multiple sources. So how do we want to, do we need to, think, maybe this is one of those things we carry over again, because I think our next meeting can be focused on these, but is there a need to develop a communication policy that addresses all segments of society, and that would get into the differences of culture and race and other things, and whether it's social media or others, and see if we can frame something that way?
Yeah, I don't know how we solve that evil. I guess if we're going to do something relative to that recommendation, my thought, just generally, since I offered it, was that we recommend that the city or the police department continues their efforts on social media. I could see where, other people in the city or, leadership in the city, not this leadership, obviously, but other leadership could say, you guys got to stop interacting on social media or representing, not under the city banner. I think it's critically important that the city of Wausau's police department maintains its social media presence and continues to enhance it and interacts in a positive way to address communication around what's happening in social media. So that's just my thought. I don't have a motion relative to that, but that would be my suggestion.
Why don't we carry that over and look for some clarifying language to capture that? We've got mental health.
I will say it might just be helpful too in terms of next time if just a straight kind of bullet point list of sort of generally the recommendations that we've made. Because sometimes I'm trying to remember the recommendations that we made in the past up to now, because I don't want to repeat ourselves on some things, and I also want to make sure things aren't missed.
So why don't we let's create a three sets, or subsets. One would be actions taken to date, actions needing clarification, and issues identified with no recommendations. And try to capture that. And again, that would be just as a starting point for a discussion, because we're carrying over a number of issues from tonight, and there are a number of issues. We'll go back and try to make sure we've captured everything. So would that help? So we would then capture the two motions that we've made tonight, three motions that we've made tonight, plus the CART and the other social. Capture all those, put that in one category, the ones that we've deferred tonight relative to communication, and others in another, and then we'll identify other issues that are outstanding, and we don't have to act on those, but at least make sure that we check them off as needing or not needing additional work. Does that make sense? So we'll have to work with, Jean's giving me the eye, but we'll get that put together. Other thoughts
And then I guess the only other sort of category is things that we had thought about in terms of not specifically for the department, but overall in terms of policing, like the recommendation of maybe the city, if they wanted to adopt a resolution in regards to sort of like an ethics board for police. We had some discussion about that in the past. Does anyone remember that? I can kind of refresh. So the discussion was a little bit further back. I had mentioned, for instance, that lawyers have a ethics board, so that, if you do something, if you have, a lawyer that does something and needs some discipline or something, they're not able then to just go to the next force, go to work somewhere else. They would have to go before that ethics board before they're able to get their license back. And so we'd had some discussion about just making a recommendation in terms of a resolution on our part that, maybe that's something in terms of overall policing that should be done in terms of an oversight committee, so that.
On a statewide basis or on a
Yeah.
local?
So does anybody remember that now? Okay.
Yeah, I remember that, and I believe the state is working on that, if I remember correct.
They are. And we'll give an update on where we are with that, or where they are at the next meeting.
Agenda item 5 also has us talking about the 5115 process and
Jefferson,
the Jefferson County approach. I don't recall hearing about the Jefferson County approach, and
that came
I
up in
don't
our,
recall what the issue was there.
that came up in our planning meeting, and it was an approach that the chief had raised, and he did some subsequent investigation of it. It was an effort to try to minimize the role of the law enforcement once the placement was attempted to be made, and I think we found that it didn't work as well as we'd like. So the whole issue of 5115 and the issue of protective placements and the role of law enforcement in providing protection and/or securing the situation, or whatever you want to call it under the statutes, is perhaps something we might want to look at. But I think we were looking at Jefferson County during our planning process with some degree of hope that there might be resolution, and I think we found that based on what Ben found, that it perhaps didn't offer as much hope as we thought.
Isn't the bottom line that if it's a social worker making the determination, the law enforcement officer still has to be the one to sign the sheet?
Yeah.
So, yeah, makes it tough. So, have some refinement in those requirements maybe, but, okay.
That's where that started and ended. All right. How do we, I'm going to ask the two members of the Police and Fire Commission, how do you feel that we should roll this out to that group? A presentation?
I'll let the chair speak.
I think we could do, we could either do a joint meeting or a presentation. Actually, I think a presentation would probably be the best way, and let the Police Fire Commission have the opportunity to ask questions about that presentation and get a good understanding.
Okay. All right. We can do that. We can work with you on the timing of that. And then again, our next meetings are the 10th and the 31st. And then presentation to the Public Health and Safety Committee on the February 21st. And then we'll have to figure out the timing on that public informational meeting on our recommendations. So I think we've made some progress. And we'll go through our notes and making sure that we didn't drop any issues. And thank you. And Kelly, before you leave, happy holidays. Thank you. Anything else before us tonight?
I just want to make one last final comment before we go. So I do want to just give my gratitude and thanks to the police department. I know it's not easy having the spotlight on them, especially given the overall scrutiny. But I hope in this process, and given, as Chief Livin said, a score really by the public of like almost 80-something%, that it only validated in terms of the great job that they're doing, and hopefully to provide more information. And in talking about, some of the things in terms of the improvements, it's not to say or to focus on, oh, they're doing this wrong or doing bad, but, you don't have to be, I think Katie once said it in regards to something, you don't have to be sick to continue to improve your wellness and health. And I think to the best of our ability, we should always be striving to do better. But in terms of their overall score and, how they've behaved in terms of this community, their work, excellent. So I just want to say that in terms of, some of the things we've mentioned in terms of cultural competence, other things, we hope that those will only further add to tools in their belt and help them to succeed. Thank you.
All right.
Well said. Mic drop. Time to adjourn. Motion to adjourn on that note.
Moved and seconded to adjourn. All those in favor?
All right.
Opposed? Thank you, and again, Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. And we have some work to do.